Have you ever sat across from your grown child, maybe at the dinner table or on the phone, and walked away from the conversation feeling small? Like somehow over time, the balance of respect shifted? You gave them everything, your time, your energy, your years, and now it feels like your voice barely matters. It's not always big blow-ups or harsh words that erode respect. Sometimes it's the little things we say without realizing it. Words spoken out of love, worry, or even humility, but they land the wrong way. And before we know it, the connection changes. The power dynamic tilts. We feel less like a respected parent and more like someone being tolerated. That's what we're talking about today. 7 phrases, harmless on the surface, even well-intentioned, that can instantly chip away at your children's respect for you. And let me tell you, age doesn't protect you from that shift. In fact, the older we get, the more careful we need to be with the words we choose. Because what we say in our 60s or 70s can define how our children treat us for the rest of our lives. So let's start with something that might sound sweet, but is anything but helpful. I can't do anything without you. Have you ever said that? Maybe it slips out when you're asking for help with technology, or when your child sets up a doctor's appointment, or fixes something around the house. You laugh and say it jokingly, "Oh, honey, I don't know what I'd do without you." But here's the thing. When you say you can't do anything without them, you're sending a subtle but powerful message. I am no longer capable. I am dependent. I need you more than you need me. And while that might sound like vulnerability or honesty, to your adult child, it often reads as pressure or even manipulation. Children, especially adult children, want to respect their parents, but they also want boundaries. They want to feel like they have a parent who still has strength, clarity, and dignity. And every time you position yourself as helpless, you take a step down from that respected place. You don't have to pretend to be superhuman. It's okay to ask for help, but there's a big difference between saying, "I could use your help with this," and "I can't do anything without you." One invites support, the other demands responsibility. One is empowering, the other is draining. And if you keep saying it, they start believing it. They start seeing you as less independent, less capable. And from there, respect starts to slide, not out of malice, but because you trained them to see you as less than you really are. Let's talk about another common one. You might say this when you feel disappointed or distant. You never call anymore. It sounds innocent enough, right? Maybe even true. You used to talk every day, and now you're lucky to get a text once a week. But here's the hard truth when you say, "You never call anymore." What your child hears is guilt, shame, and blame. It doesn't make them want to pick up the phone more. It makes them feel like a failure. Like no matter what they do, they'll always disappoint you. And people, no matter how old they are, tend to avoid what makes them feel bad. So the more you say this, the less they want to engage. Not because they don't care, but because they don't want to feel like a disappointment every time they talk to you. And it becomes a loop. You feel forgotten. So you say something that sounds like a complaint. They feel criticized, so they pull back even more. And the distance grows. Instead of saying, "Wait, you never call?" try saying, "I love it when we talk. Hearing your voice always makes my day." You're expressing the same need, connection, but from a place of love instead of lack. And when people feel appreciated, not guilt-tripped, they're much more likely to respond. Now let's move into something a little trickier. Sometimes, out of fear of losing the relationship or out of fear of confrontation, we start to say things like, "Whatever you think is best." You might say this when your child makes a big decision you disagree with. Maybe it's about parenting, finances, or even how they treat you. Instead of speaking your truth, you back away. You shrink. You make yourself small. At first glance, it seems respectful. You're letting them live their life. But in reality, it can come across as passive, disconnected, or even bitter, especially if it's said with a sigh or a tone that says, "I don't really agree, but I'm giving up." What your child hears is not wisdom, but resignation. And over time, this builds a pattern where your voice no longer counts. You become someone who just nods and goes along with whatever they say, even when you feel differently. That doesn't earn respect, it erodes it. Now, this doesn't mean you need to argue or impose your views, but there's a way to share your perspective that's both strong and loving. Instead of saying, "Whatever you think is best," try, "I have a different view, but I trust you to make your own decision." You're honoring your own wisdom while still giving them space to choose. They may not always agree with you, but they will respect that you have your own mind. And that's something our generation needs to hold on to. Just because we're older doesn't mean we should fade quietly into the background of our children's lives. We have decades of life experience, hard-earned lessons, and emotional intelligence that's worth sharing. But if we silence ourselves, if we defer too much or speak in ways that diminish our worth, we end up becoming invisible. That's not how respect is built, that's how it's lost. As we get older, it becomes more important than ever to speak from strength, not fear. To express love without guilt. To offer wisdom without surrendering our voice. And to ask for help without collapsing into helplessness. These small shifts in language, in tone, in presence, they matter more than you think. Because our children, no matter how grown they are still watching us, still learning from us, still shaping their perception of us with every interaction. You are not just a parent. You are a role model for how to age with dignity, how to love with clarity, and how to stay strong even as the years pass. So choose your words with care. Speak like someone who deserves to be heard. Because you do. And with that, let's keep going. We've been talking about how some everyday phrases, often spoken with the best of intentions, can quietly chip away at the respect your children have for you. Not because they're ungrateful or cold, but because certain words carry more emotional weight than we realize. And when we speak from fear, frustration, or habit, we sometimes create a distance we never meant to. Now let's look at a phrase that might sound loving, even noble. But in reality, it can create the kind of imbalance that leaves you feeling empty and your child feeling burdened. I gave up everything for you. Maybe you've said it out loud, or maybe it's just lingered in your heart. Either way, it's a heavy statement. A true one, maybe. You did sacrifice. You did work late, cook meals, stay up worrying, put their needs ahead of your own more times than you can count. You did give them your best years. But when those words come out, "I gave up everything for you," they don't land as love. They land as guilt. What your child hears is, "You owe me." And no one, at any age, responds well to that. Love, when used like a transaction, always backfires. Because the second you tie your sacrifices to what they should be doing for you now, more calls, more visits, more obedience, you shift the entire relationship from respect to repayment. And repayment is a debt, not a bond. You might think reminding them of everything you did will wake them up, make them see how much you deserve. But often it makes them pull away. They start to feel trapped, like they can't ever do enough to match what you gave. Or worse, they begin to resent you for making love sound like a price tag. If you truly gave out of love, then let that love stand without condition. And if you're feeling overlooked, it's okay to say so honestly. "Sometimes I feel like I'm not as important in your life anymore. I miss you." That's real, that's human, and it invites connection, not guilt. Respect grows from shared truth, not emotional scorekeeping. Another phrase that sneaks in, especially during moments of disagreement, is this one: "You'll understand when you're older." It sounds wise, parental, maybe even fair, but what it often communicates is, "You don't know anything and I'm done talking." It shuts down the conversation. It puts a wall between your lived experience and theirs. And instead of helping them grow, it makes them feel dismissed. Yes, you do have more life behind you than they do. But wisdom doesn't always need to announce itself. When you say, "You'll understand when you're older," you're not giving them insight. You're postponing understanding indefinitely. Instead, try opening the door. Say something like, "I see this differently because of what I've lived through. If you ever want to hear more, I'd be glad to share." That's respectful. That honors your perspective without dismissing theirs. And you'd be surprised how often that small gesture leads to real conversation. When adult children feel respected, they're far more willing to listen, far more likely to ask your advice instead of avoiding it. Now here's one that's tough to spot, because it's often disguised as humility or self-deprecation. "I'm just an old fool." You might say it with a chuckle after forgetting something, or when you're being corrected. It sounds harmless, maybe even endearing. But over time, it trains your children to see you as someone who's, well, not worth listening to. Words matter. And when you joke about your own decline, mentally, physically, or emotionally, you give people permission to take you less seriously. You start to fade in their eyes, not because you've changed, but because you've told them not to expect much from you. Don't talk yourself into irrelevance. You are not a fool. You are not just old. You are a whole person with decades of life under your belt. And even if your memory slips or your knees ache, or you mix up names every now and then, that doesn't make you any less worthy of being heard. The way you speak about yourself shapes how others see you. So speak with pride, not pity. Say, "I may not be as quick as I once was, but I've learned a few things that still matter." That lands differently, that earns attention, that earns respect. Finally, let's talk about one of the most common and most damaging things a parent can say to a child, even well into adulthood. "I'm only trying to help." This one usually shows up during conflict. Maybe your child tells you to back off or says you're being controlling. And in defense, you say it, "I'm only trying to help." But here's what that phrase does. It invalidates their experience. It says, "My intention matters more than your feelings." And no matter how true it is that your heart was in the right place, those words often come across as tone-deaf, as dismissive, as a way of saying, "You shouldn't be upset because I meant well." But people don't react to our intentions. They react to our impact. If your help wasn't received as helpful, then you need to pause and listen, not explain, not defend. Just listen. And instead of saying, "I'm only trying to help," try this. "I didn't mean to overstep. Thank you for telling me how that felt to you." That's emotional maturity. That's humility. And most importantly, that's the kind of parent adult children respect. No one wants to feel like they're being fixed, especially by someone who doesn't seem willing to reflect. So if your goal is connection, not control, then lead with curiosity, not correction. At this stage of life, your role isn't to steer their ship. It's to be the lighthouse. Steady, strong, and trustworthy. You're not there to chase them into better choices. You're there to stand tall in your own truth and let them come to you when they need that light. When your children know you respect their autonomy, they'll respect your guidance. When they know you listen, they'll start asking what you think. When they know you're solid in who you are, they'll lean in. Because strength like that is rare and deeply needed. You don't have to chase respect. You just have to stop pushing it away. Let's talk about one more phrase. It's one that might feel like an expression of love, a heartfelt way to show your devotion. But it can quietly undermine everything you've built as a parent, especially now in your later years. It's when you say, "I just want you to be happy." Now, at first glance, who could argue with that? It sounds selfless, generous, even noble. And deep down, you probably mean it. After all, you've spent most of your life making sacrifices so your kids could have a better one. Their happiness matters to you. But when you keep repeating, "I just want you to be happy," especially in the face of hurtful behavior, crossed boundaries, or choices that leave you feeling unseen or disrespected, what you're really saying is, "I'll ignore my own needs if it means you'll smile." And that creates a dangerous pattern. Over time, your child starts to assume that your needs don't exist, or worse, that they don't matter. They get used to your silence, your willingness to be the emotional doormat, the one who always smiles and nods and says, "Whatever makes you happy." And that's how respect dies, not through conflict, but through quiet erasure. Because respect isn't just about loving someone. It's about knowing where they stand. It's about seeing that they have boundaries, a backbone, a sense of dignity that doesn't disappear just because they love you. If you really want to teach your children something powerful at this stage in life, show them what it means to love without losing yourself. Let them see that even now, you still matter. Your happiness matters. Your values matter. And yes, their joy is important, but it's not the only thing. Try saying instead, "I care about your happiness. And I also want a relationship where I feel respected too." That opens the door to mutual understanding. That says, "I'm not here to control you, but I'm also not here to disappear." And that is the kind of message that earns real, lasting respect. Now, I want to pause for a moment and say something directly to you from one human being to another. If you've recognized any of these phrases in your own words, you're not alone. You haven't failed. You haven't ruined anything. We all speak from emotion sometimes. We all fall into patterns that feel familiar or protective. And when you love your kids deeply, which I know you do, it's easy to slip into language that comes from fear or longing or exhaustion. But here's the beautiful part. It's never too late to shift. It's never too late to speak from a place of strength instead of scarcity. To build new patterns of communication rooted in honesty, maturity, and love without self-erasure. To stop chasing approval and instead embody the kind of quiet confidence that invites respect naturally. Because let's be honest, many of us in our 60s, 70s, and beyond have been conditioned to stay small, to avoid conflict, to keep the peace. But keeping the peace should never come at the cost of your voice. You are still growing, still evolving, still worthy of being heard, seen, and respected, especially by the children you raised. So let me remind you of something you might have forgotten. You are not a burden. You are not outdated. You are not someone who needs to apologize for having emotions, opinions, or boundaries. You are a parent, a guide, a living example of how to move through life with grace and strength, even when it gets hard. And if you want to show your children how to live with dignity, start by modeling it yourself. Speak clearly, set boundaries lovingly, and never ever sacrifice your self-worth in the name of keeping your child happy at your expense, because they don't need you to be perfect. They need you to be real. They need to know that love can coexist with limits, that compassion doesn't require self-sacrifice, that a parent can still lead, not by control, but by example. So as you move forward from this video, take a moment to reflect, not with shame, but with intention. Ask yourself, what do I want my relationship with my children to look like? What do I want them to remember about the way I spoke to them, even in old age? And what would it look like to stop chasing their approval and start standing in my truth? Respect begins when you do. Now, if this video resonated with you, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Share a moment when you recognized one of these patterns in your life, or even a breakthrough you've had in your own parenting journey. Your story might be the encouragement someone else needs right now. And if you found this helpful, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel, Strong Elderly Life. We're building a space here where aging isn't about fading away. It's about standing tall, speaking clearly, and living your truth without apology. You've spent your life giving love, Now it's time to receive it in a way that honors your voice, your wisdom, and your worth. Here's to living with strength, dignity, and a voice that's impossible to ignore. Here's to living your best life at any age.